We obviously could not know at the time when I got that first phone call from Sheila that this would be happening. But we could have predicted, and many did predict, that these next couple of weeks before Biden becomes president is going to be very, very challenging and potentially destabilizing, as it appears to be a last shot for those who have done everything they can in the last 4 years to kill the nuclear deal, make sure the US and Iran cannot have any constructive diplomacy, create maximum barriers on that road. It's their last chance to be able to inflict as much damage as possible on this. And indeed, that is what they're trying to do. Let's assess what has happened, what it means, and what it doesn't mean. Obviously, at this point, it's quite clear the Israelis were behind it. When I talk to officials, it's clear to everyone. In fact, Israeli officials have confirmed that they were behind it to the New York Times, to the Daily Beast. It's not a secret. Even their official denials have been extremely tame and benign, with not much passion or conviction behind them. So we can set aside the issue as to whether Israel was behind it or not. It's quite clear that it was. It is also quite clear that the United States was in some way, shape, or form supportive of it. We saw movements of ships and troops to the region right before this happened. These were not things that were revealed by any journalists. These were press releases that went out from Pentagon saying we're moving troops to the Middle East. We're moving B-52s to the Middle East. And then it's been revealed through reporting in a couple of newspapers that Trump himself has essentially signaled to Pompeo, who is the driving force of this within the administration, that he has even more leash than he had before, even more freedom of doing things. The red line is that apparently Trump doesn't want to have a major military confrontation, but anything short of that seems to be okay. And I think we have to keep one thing in mind. This is all happening at a time when Trump truly is not paying attention. He is entirely focused on a whole set of other issues, which has given those elements in the administration that never were in favor of diplomacy in the first place, who were trying to create a war, a maximum pressure, all of this, even more leeway and maneuverability to pursue their agenda, an agenda that at the end of the day, if it comes to its fruition, its full fruition, will be contradicting the agenda that Trump himself claims that he is pursuing. Now, was this then done to be able to set back the Iranian nuclear program, which has been the main, this surface explanation for this? When you take a look at the large number of assassinations that have taken place in the past, and Israel has conducted 6 to 8 of those in the time frame of 2007 to 2011, almost none of them took place against individuals that played critical roles in the program and as a result could decisively impact the direction of the program. Moreover, the timing of those assassinations did not take place in such a way that it actually prevented the Iranians from moving forward into a new era of its nuclear program. It was not happening at the cusp of any major nuclear breakthroughs. The assassinations tended to take place at the moment when the US and Iran were at the cusp of a diplomatic breakthrough. And this is precisely why, even under the Obama administration, these assassinations were interpreted as an effort by the Israelis to undermine diplomacy rather than really undermining the nuclear program. This is part of the reason why in 2011, if I'm not mistaken, the Obama administration itself leaked to the US media that the Israelis were behind the assassination. At one point, Hillary Clinton even took to the podium to, in person, condemn the assassination because the anger and frustration was so intense that the Israelis were doing this to undermine Obama. My conversations with people in the Biden camp have made it completely clear that not only do they view Israel as being behind it, they also view this as a deliberate effort to undermine diplomacy. In and of itself, this one attack does not appear to have that impact. It will definitely complicate matters. We have seen developments in the Iranian parliament. They're putting pressure on the administration, on the Rouhani administration, to take measures, to have a deadline for how long it can take before the Iranians will escalate some of their nuclear expansion even further, unless sanctions relief have come to Iran, meaning that the US walks back into the deal. The question is not if this one single event will have that devastating impact in terms of closing the window for diplomacy. The question is if the next couple of events that presumably will occur before Biden comes in will have that collective magnitude to be able to prevent diplomacy from taking place, or at a minimum make it so difficult for Biden that he simply may be deterred from even trying. That's where the worry is. And that's where the question then comes in. Why has the Biden administration seemingly not reacted harsher to this in order to clearly signal the Netanyahu government of how much not only Biden disapproves of it, but what the consequences could be? Well, perhaps the reason I said seemingly is because we should not assume that no communication has taken place. There are signs that some communication has been taking place. Some of it actually has been public. We saw that John Brennan put out this tweet very quickly after the assassination, a very, very harsh, angry tweet in which he strongly condemned this. He called it not only terrorism, a criminal act, but he called it terrorism. He also called it state-sponsored terrorism. That's a very, very clear finger at the only state that has the capacity and the political will to do this. This may have been a signal from the Biden camp, mindful of the fact that the Biden team most likely felt that if they were to get involved in this too overtly, it could violate those norms of the United States only having one president at a time. Moreover, there may have been signals in private that may have been even more clear along these lines. What I think is interesting is that Biden himself gave an interview to Tom Friedman at the New York Times in which he did touch upon this issue. And what came out of that interview is A, nothing has changed as a result of the assassination. Biden did not come out and add any new conditions or say, well, as a result of this, I don't know if we can move in as fast. On the contrary, he said he's looking forward to a clean compliance for compliance arrangement, which essentially means the United States goes back into compliance with the nuclear deal, meaning lifting all of the sanctions, et cetera, that have been imposed in violation of the JCPOA, and the Iranians in turn go back into their compliance. That is the easiest, fastest way of doing it. And then he talked about add-on agreements. And it's very important when the term add-on is used, it essentially means it's not a renegotiation of the JCPOA. The JCPOA stays, but on top of the JCPOA, you can then negotiate additional agreements. And those agreements could, on the one hand, address some aspects of the nuclear issue, perhaps an extension of some of the sunset clauses, as some have called them, some of the elements of the deal that expires, you can extend the timeline for it, etc. In return, of course, for more sanctions relief and other measures. But it could and also go outside of the JCPOA and include regional issues such as Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, missiles, etc. And then he also added that in those add-on agreements, you could have the inclusion of some of the Arab states that have strictly opposed the JCPOA, but using the pretext that they were not part of it. Well, when it comes to the regional issues, they certainly should be part of the diplomacy. That also, of course, means that they have to perform diplomacy. They have to negotiate in good faith. I'm not convinced that they're ready to do so, but I believe it's critical for them to be included. And apparently that is the game plan of the Biden administration as well. One critical element here, which obviously the interview did not go into sufficient detail to reveal, but based on my understanding, most likely is the manner in which Trump will approach this, is that if the negotiations on the add-ons fail, it does not affect the JCPOA. The future of the JCPOA is not dependent upon the success of the add-on agreements in terms of negotiating them. They may not be able to come to an agreement on those issues, but that doesn't mean that the JCPOA baseline would be upended if they fail. On the contrary, it will stay there. It will be a foundation that is solid, will remain in place regardless, but hopefully they will succeed in negotiating additional add-on agreements that addresses other issues or may also address some issues within the JCPOA. But that also, for instance, means that if they fail to come to an agreement on how to extend the restrictions on some of these elements from 5 to 15 years, for instance, just because they fail to do so doesn't mean that the JCPOA then collapses and everything is lost. And this is really essential, because if it's not interpreted this way, then it essentially means that they're renegotiating the JCPOA. And that is something that not only Iranians, but also the Europeans and others have made quite clear is not really on the table. The element of all of this that I think has been the least attended to in the US media and in the conversation is not so much whether Trump was in on it or not. I think it's quite clear that he was. It's that this is a rather peculiar behavior, even for the standards of Netanyahu. Under normal circumstances, countries right now are paying very little attention to what Trump or whichever outgoing president there is, and is turning their focus to what are the preferences, the ideas, the goals, and the likely policies of the next administration. And they do everything they can to put themselves in the best possible footing with the next administration and the next president. Here you have Netanyahu do quite the opposite. He is not only disregarding the preferences, the stated and explicit preferences of the incoming president, he is directly and deliberately undermining that preference and undermining the strategy that Biden has said that he wants to pursue. And I said even for Netanyahu standards, that is quite shocking. Because when you take a look at the history of Obama and Netanyahu's relationship, they had a famously bad relationship. Netanyahu, incidentally, has had a famously bad relationship with almost all American presidents. It may not have started that way, but it's always ended that way. But in the case of Netanyahu and Obama, it started on a very, very bad footing. Their first meeting in May 2009 at the White House was quite a disaster. But it was a disaster not by design. It did not appear as if either side actually intended to throw the first blow. What happened was a series of miscalculations and misunderstandings. Obama raised the issue of a settlement freeze, which Netanyahu took as Obama pulling the rug under his feet, because such a big request apparently needed to have been cleared before it would ever be brought up in a direct conversation between the two of them. So he was taken aback and surprised by it and felt that he was knifed in the back. That was not how it was intended. At the same time, he paid back rather quickly, because at that very press conference that day, he put words in Obama's mouth, claiming that in their private conversation, Obama had said things about his Iran strategy that Obama probably didn't say, and even if he did it, he did not want it to be public. Netanyahu wanted it to be public because he knew that if those statements were made public, it would make diplomacy more difficult. And both sides walked away from that meeting extremely frustrated and angry at each other, particularly that moment when Netanyahu in front of Obama essentially says, "Thank you for saying this in our private conversation." And there was no agreement that those elements of that conversation would be made public. But at the end of the day, it was a series of miscalculations and misunderstandings. What you have here with Netanyahu going forward with an assassination directly and deliberately aimed at undermining Biden is quite different. It means that Netanyahu has taken off his gloves and he is throwing the first punch even before Biden even has had a chance to swear the oath or even write his inaugural address. That is quite shocking, I have to say. I do not know how the Biden team has interpreted this. Whether this reinforces their belief that they actually have to find some sort of a solution that makes Netanyahu happy, which I do not believe is possible. I do not believe there's any solution that entails improved US-Iran relations that Netanyahu would be content with. Or whether it reinforces their belief that in order to get this done, they have to give up the illusion that you actually can please all of these different actors at the same time, and instead put clear US national security at the center of their strategy. And if that means there needs to be some form of an agreement with Iran on the nuclear front, perhaps another agreement on regional issues, that needs to be pursued in order to protect the United States. And do everything you can to make sure that this is also good for the other states in the region, of course, but not necessarily pleasing every single political leader whose political ambitions and orientations may simply be impossible to please. Moreover, it raises questions as to whether this administration, the Biden administration, believes that you can have a nuclear deal that is durable if it continues to exist solely within a context in which the United States and Iran remain bitter enemies. I think one of the conclusions of the last 4 years, not just here, but also in Tehran, needs to be that if you actually want to see the nuclear deal survive, you need to create an infrastructure of diplomatic activity and systems and mechanisms around it in order to protect it and insulate it from external shocks, including negative developments in their relationships on other issues. That did not exist. In my view, it means that the United States and Iran, if they truly want to keep the nuclear deal, they have to go for a much better relationship between the two countries, because the idea that the nuclear deal can survive and endure while the two countries are at each other's throats is essentially proven false. The fact that this time around, the Iranians kept themselves into the deal and did not walk out should not be an indication that that will happen every time either the US or the Iranians try to pull out of the deal. We need to have mechanisms and buffers that ensures that this deal can survive and will not be the victim of every political wind that blows in Tehran, in Riyadh, in Tel Aviv, or in Washington. This, I think, is probably the biggest failure of the previous team, of the Obama team and the Iranians, because they had an exaggerated view of how institutionalized this deal was, even though they had clear warnings. Remember, Senator Tom Cotton wrote a letter to the Supreme Leader of Iran in the midst of the negotiations, promising him, don't trust the President of the United States because we who oppose the deal will undo the deal as soon as Obama is out of office. Those of us who was working on this issue at the time, we did kind of laugh at this. We thought it was a completely inappropriate thing, something that actually undermined the US negotiating position, but we did not see it as being a credible threat. It was. And the question is, what will the United States and Iran do if they do manage to go back to the JCPOA to ensure that this cannot happen again? I'll stop there and be happy to take your questions.